Because under US President Donald Trump, America's foreign policy is becoming more aggressive and hardline. From strong-arm diplomacy and pressure tactics to trade threats against allies and talk of new peace wars, Washington is increasingly acting on its own terms, often sidelining global institutions. That bigger picture now plays out sharply in Venezuela. CIA Director John Ratcliffe met Venezuela's acting president Delcy Rodriguez in Caracas to discuss cooperation, making it the highest-level Trump administration engagement since Nicolas Maduro's capture. With tensions rising in Venezuela, US President Donald Trump linked his drive to take control of Greenland to his failure to win the Nobel Peace Prize, saying he is no longer thought purely of peace. Trump also intensified his push to wrest sovereignty from Greenland from fellow NATO member Denmark, threatening punitive tariffs on countries which stand in his way. And this is not it. Trump has also proposed an international board of peace aimed at overseeing post-war governance and reconstruction in Gaza. Apart from India, several countries, including Argentina, Canada, Egypt, Turkey, Albania, and Cyprus, have been invited. But ironically, the United States also invited Pakistan to join this board of peace. Trump also wrote a blunt letter to Norwegian Prime Minister, linking the Nobel Committee's decision not to award him the Nobel Peace Prize to his hardened stance on Greenland, saying that he no longer feels bound to think of peace. So the big question tonight, is Donald Trump reshaping global order through pressure and power rather than peace and consensus? I have a very special guest joining us from Caracas, Phil Gunson, an international crisis group analyst, to decode it all for us. Thanks so much, Phil Gunson, for joining us. And let me begin by asking you, when it comes to CIA Director John Ratcliffe having traveled to Venezuela to meet with acting President Delcy Rodriguez, becoming the highest-ranking Trump administration official to visit the South American country after US's raid that captured Nicolas Maduro, how do you see this development?
I think it's very unusual, but of course we're in extremely unusual circumstances ever since the US intervention of January the 3rd. Prior to that, it would have been unthinkable for a president of Venezuela to be meeting with the head of the CIA. And in fact, I think the government here is a little embarrassed about it. It was the US government, I think, that produced the photos of that meeting. But of course, as I say, the times are very unusual. It seems at the moment as if the Venezuelan government is essentially following instructions from Washington.
I'm also asking you this because Machado last week presented her Nobel Peace Prize to US President Donald Trump. How do you look at that?
She did, yes. And a lot of people in Venezuela found that a rather strange decision. It's, I think, a combination of things. For one thing, I think Maria Corina Machado genuinely admires Donald Trump. And she, of course, was asking for years before this for the US to take decisive military action against the Venezuelan government. But in addition to that, of course, it's well known that giving Donald Trump gifts, and in particular things that he's wanted for a long time, such as the Nobel Peace Prize, is something that may influence his policy going forward. Now, it seems at the moment as if Trump has no intention of installing Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez, the substitute candidate who won the presidential election in July of 2024, installing them in power. For the moment, he seems to prefer the idea of working with the present government because, as he has said, and people around him have said, Machado and Gonzalez don't really have the ability to control the armed forces. They don't have sufficient support in the military. And that could lead, if things went badly wrong, that could lead to violent chaos. So I think Trump, for the moment, wants to rely on those who are already in power, at least while the economy is stabilized and they produce some kind of economic growth. That seems to be the idea.
Right, and despite Maduro's removal, the same security, intelligence, judicial, and even propaganda apparatus remains intact under Delcy Rodriguez. In this context, is the US strategy effectively entrenching Madurismo without Maduro, and therefore does it not risk perpetuating an unreformed authoritarian system under a new phase?
I think that's exactly what many people fear, and I would include myself in that. Of course, in the three-point plan that was outlined by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, there is the intention, at least, of reaching a political transition at some point. In other words, there would have to be reform of the institutions here, reintroduction of democratic principles, free and fair elections, which would no doubt lead to the replacement of the current government with the people who are currently in opposition. But of course, we don't know when that will be, and Trump has referred to it as one day or sometime in the future. He's talked about the U.S. controlling Venezuela for many years, running Venezuela. He's even styled himself the acting president of Venezuela. So I think there's certainly a fear that Washington and Caracas may get what they want out of this, the respective governments, in the form of economic and financial benefits. But whether that will ever turn into some kind of political transformation of Venezuela, whether the majority of Venezuelans who obviously want change will ultimately get what they want, is very much an open question at the moment.
Also, when the US captured Maduro, Donald Trump claimed that the dictator and terrorist Maduro is finally gone in Venezuela and that people are free. However, his most hardline enforcer, Diosdado Cabello, still remains in power. Now, we've seen how various agencies have reported that US talks with hardline Venezuela Minister Cabello began months before the raid. And if this was indeed truly about saving democracy and quote-unquote freeing the people of Venezuela, does this not further substantiate claims that this operation was essentially a regime change exercise and there's little more than the optics of democracy here?
Yes, I think the issue here is that the US clearly has been talking to the people in the government here. It's not true that these talks have led so far to freedom for the Venezuelan people. There are still hundreds of political prisoners here, although it's true that many have been released in recent days. There's still repression. There is no freedom of the press. The opposition political parties can't operate freely in the country. Many opposition politicians are in exile. And so if there is some kind of deal between the Trump administration and Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister, the main hardliner, as well as the Rodriguez siblings who are in power, Delcy and her brother Jorge, who runs the parliament, if that deal is in place, and the government here has to do what the US says, then the big question becomes, how much is the US prepared to push the government here to reintroduce democracy, if that may result in instability? In other words, if instability continues to be a problem, which it is, will the US simply settle for economic reform and for benefits derived from sales of oil? Or will there be efforts to negotiate some kind of political transition? And we really don't know at this point.
Also, President Trump has openly linked punitive tariffs on European allies to his demand to buy Greenland. That's a move that many in Europe describe as economic coercion. With the EU now considering activating its trade bazooka, how dangerous is this kind of weaponization of trade by the US president, and what does it signal about the future of rules-based relations?
Yes, rules-based relations throughout the world are under challenge, of course, not only by the US, but by other powers such as Russia and even China. I think the problem here is that not only that this is a policy which implies control through brute force, through the idea that might is right, but it's also very volatile and very incoherent. We saw right back at the beginning of Trump's second administration that he applied tariffs to a very large number of countries, some of which didn't even exist, some of whom, had been running trade deficits with the United States, a very incoherent application of tariffs. And then adding to that incoherence was the fact that, Trump didn't stick to what he said, that he, for apparently very, how can I put it, very arbitrary reasons, would reduce tariffs or put them back on, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes for things that seemed very much to do with his own personal wishes or his own resentments even. So the world is trying to come to terms not just with the United States behaving in this way, but also that it's not consistent, even from one week to the next. It's very difficult to run economies and very difficult to run state, bilateral or multilateral relations if the world's major power is behaving in this erratic fashion.
Also, with Venezuela now firmly under Trump's control, do you think that this could embolden him to take military action against Iran, given that any oil disruption in the Middle East could potentially be offset by Venezuelan supplies?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, and in Crisis Group, I have colleagues who are better placed to answer that question. I think Trump has definitely been emboldened, and if I can stick just to the Western Hemisphere, immediately after the very successful, dramatic operation here in Venezuela on January the 3rd, he immediately started talking again about, as you say, Greenland, about Panama. Started talking about the possibility of attacks against non-state groups in Mexico and Colombia, talking about hitting the drug cartels with military operations, maybe special forces, or hitting them from a distance. He's emboldened, and I think he feels right now, it would appear, that there are no limits to his power.
Right.
So yes, I mean, I think governments certainly in this region, many of them are feeling quite nervous and adopting different postures. Sometimes they stand up and oppose what Donald Trump is suggesting. Sometimes they attempt to work with him. But it's a very, the region, I think, feels very unstable right now. And even regional bodies like CARICOM, for example, the Caribbean nations, mostly island states, they have had a very long standing policy of regarding the Caribbean as a peace zone where disputes were resolved peacefully. But CARICOM, as well as the other regional organizations, are very much divided now between those who prepare to work with Trump and those who feel that it's essential to come together to form some kind of counterweight to what the US is doing.
Also, based on emerging trends, as far as Trump is concerned, he's proposed a board of peace and invited countries like India. Despite cautious global responses, does this reflect an attempt to bypass the UN Security Council and, in effect, undermine the legitimacy of established multilateral institutions such as the UN?
Well, again, I'm going to stick to the Western Hemisphere because I'm not really entitled to speak about Asian affairs. But I think, in general, again, multilateralism is on the defensive and in a very bad state, I think, around the world, from the UN Security Council down. On Venezuela, the UN Security Council has found it very difficult, not to say impossible, to take any action on Venezuela because, on the one hand, you've had the US and then two other permanent members, Russia and China, who have been defending the Venezuelan government. So the UN Security Council is deadlocked on this, but regional organizations like the Organization of American States are passing through a very bad time, really. They're not in good shape, and that's principally because ideological considerations within the region, differences of opinion over whether it's important to step forward and defend democracy, whether there is any future in trying to resolve a conflict like Venezuela. Countries are divided on these issues, and
absolutely,
a lot of the time the division runs along ideological fault lines. Sometimes it's to do with financial and economic interests. But whatever it is, the regional bodies here in this hemisphere, not just OAS, the Organization of American States, but the more recently formed CELAC, which is a regional body which excludes the US and Canada, they have not been able to come to any form of agreement on how to proceed with Venezuela, despite formal commitments to democracy and the rule of law.
Thank you so much, Phil Gunson, for joining us and breaking down all of those developments, particularly Venezuela, the United States, and what one can expect in coming days. Thanks so much for joining us, indeed.